O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Good afternoon, members. Minister's statement. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce the launch of the new Municipal Elections website created by the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs in partnership with the Northwest Territories Association of Communities. This website provides easily accessible municipal election resources to prospective candidates, community governments, and the general public. In addition to providing recent municipal election results, the website contains information on the dates, number of seats, and terms for upcoming municipal elections. Mr. Speaker, the website targets three main audiences. These are members of the public who are considering running in a municipal election, candidates who have been elected, and returning officers who administer the elections. For members of the public who are considering running in a municipal election, we have created the Before You Run section. This section provides information on the roles and responsibilities of an elected official, candidate eligibility, campaigning, and what to expect if a recount is needed. For those who have been elected as a municipal councillor or mayor, we have created the Now That You Are Elected section. This section helps elected officials better understand their roles and responsibilities as community leaders. The website also provides information on conflict of interest, code of conduct, and financial matters. For returning officers who administer municipal elections, we've included resources on the legislation that governs local government elections, including the Local Authorities Elections Act. The Returning Officer Manual is included as a resource. The manual clearly outlines the responsibilities of returning officers and provides a step-by-step guide to running a municipal election. Mr. Speaker, the Municipal Elections website has been designed as a resource to be used throughout the year. If a resident would like to know when the next election is or the length of term of a council seat, this information is now easily accessible. If a municipal councillor wants more information on code of conduct or conflict of interest, a trusted source of information is now available. Mr. Speaker, as community governments approach their elections later this year, the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs and the Northwest Territories Association of Communities will continue to promote this website to support candidates, returning officers, and elected officials. We hope that community leaders will visit this resource on a regular basis, not only to better understand their role in the community, but to improve overall governance at the municipal level. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the courageous and difficult work of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission should be a benchmark in Canada's relationship with our First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. But the news every day tells us that rather than being more united, the world is becoming more fractured. Instead of more caring and love, political dialogue articulates more hate. That's why it will take serious, deliberate, and brave actions to try to unify people and communities. And the TRC's calls to action should offer a roadmap to heal the wounds of the past and move toward a fairer, more just society by providing the basis for an honest, open conversation. It concerns me, Mr. Speaker, that I don't know if our government is doing enough to respond to those calls to action. Have our dedicated public servants had the opportunities for learning and growth the TRC recommended? Are our senior managers and directors receiving training and orientation as the calls to action describe? How are we overcoming the gaps in education and health? Are we fully committed to restorative justice and significantly lessening Indigenous incarceration rates in the N.W.T? I was inspired recently, Mr. Speaker, by some reading about the approach taken by the City of Edmonton. Edmonton established an Indigenous Relations Office. Last summer, they held Reconciliation Week to mark the anniversary of the TRC, and later they held an event called We Are All Treaty People. It was designed to engage the public in a discussion about culture and history, educate them about the treaties, and to celebrate the historic contribution of our country's First Nations. Mr. Speaker, I don't suggest the N.W.T should be acting like a municipal government, and I'm aware of our positive collaborations with our Indigenous governments. But similar events in the North, especially here in Yellowknife, where many other non-Indigenous people live, would go a long way in educating all of us on the important work we have as a society toward finding truth and reconciliation. Mr. Speaker, truth and reconciliation is about changing attitudes, and we must lead the way and make the calls to action a high priority for this government. At the appropriate time, I'll have questions for the Premier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we will likely soon have a new industry in our territories, manufacturing wood pellets. Aurora Wood Pellets operated at Enterprise is expected to create many jobs at its mills and jobs for woodcutters from 2 First Nation communities. This is a very good thing. I see from the records of the N.W.T Land and Water Boards that the green trees will be cut at various sites for pellet making. Cleared lands are expected to regrow naturally without tree planting. The cuttings that have been approved is deemed to be sustainable for our forest. This is also good. What is much more or less clear is whether cutting virgin forest in the N.W.T and then burning it as wood pellets is an environmentally sound thing to do. The release of greenhouse gas figures big in this equation. Another factor is that the live trees remove carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. Currently, most of the wood pellets burnt here for heat come from Alberta and BC. They are made from sawmill waste that would otherwise be burnt without producing useful heat or energy. That is the main reason why burning these pellets instead of heating oil results in less greenhouse gas going into the atmosphere. I'm concerned this environmental benefit might be lost if we turn slow-growing northern forest into wood pellets, whether they are burnt here or elsewhere in the world. So far, I have not been able to find any studies of this question and assessing the environmental impact of our wood pellet operation. On the other hand, I found studies, including one published by the Canadian Forest Service, showing that the use of Canadian green forest as the source of fuel for power or even heating release more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere than other fossil fuels, even coal. Mr. Speaker, this tells me that caution is warranted as our territories break into wood pellet industry. It tells me that this new enterprise might be more environmentally friendly if we use the byproduct of sawmills that produce northern lumber. This is a business that we once had and have lost. I'm also afraid that the piecemealing review of the projects may result in, well, overlooking the forest for the trees when it comes to greenhouse gas. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Yellowknife Centre.
Massey, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, privacy is a fundamental individual right that is under constant threat in this digital era. A reminder of the importance of privacy and the diligence required for government to safeguard the information it collects comes from a recent N.W.T Information and Privacy Commissioner ruling. In 2015, a patient at the Inuvik Hospital complained to the CEO of an unwelcome visit from one of the medical clerks who worked there. This complaint touched off a round of investigations that revealed there was, quote, a culture of inappropriately accessing patient information, end quote, within the clinic, or in plain language, snooping. The Information and Privacy Commissioner found that there was a poor understanding of privacy in the clinic, poorly administered policies and procedures, poor supervision, and poor orientation for users of the electronic record system. Further, the IPC concluded, quote, most likely there are similar problems in other health facilities as well, end quote. Mr. Speaker, to remedy the situation, the IPC made a number of recommendations. She suggested that there be a designated senior staff person responsible for privacy. He or she would deliver policy development, training, and supervision on privacy issues. He or she would conduct periodic audits to ensure staff weren't snooping. This privacy complaint was not the first the hospital received. In 2012, the IPC had investigated a different complaint on the same topic and made a set of recommendations. Some of those recommendations had not been acted on when the second complaint came along 3 years later. For example, the IPC recommended that each electronic medical record user have a unique username and password. This recommendation wasn't followed. This recommendation is repeated in her 2017 report, along with the suggestion that new employees not be granted access to the system until they've been fully informed of privacy and confidentiality issues related to medical records. A second unimplemented recommendation from 2012 was to grant access to electronic records based on the role staff had at the hospital. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may complete your statement.
Merci, colleagues. At the time of her report, the Information and Privacy Commissioner found that almost everyone at the N.W.T hospital had close to full access to the whole system. This recommendation on limitation is also repeated in the 2017 report. Mr. Speaker, residents of the N.W.T must have confidence that this government is taking their right to privacy seriously. I will have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Goodman and the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Municipal and Community Services is a territorial leader in emergency planning. Each community is responsible for developing its own emergency plan, one to help them deal with things like forest fire evacuations, community-wide power outages, and more. But MACA is always there to help. I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Speaker, because emergency planning is on the people's minds in the Mackenzie Delta. The recent windstorm and multi-day power outage in Polituck really drove home how easy it can be for a community to fall prey to natural forces. Residents also remember in 2004 when fire destroyed the Fort McPherson power plant, leaving the residents in the cold and minus 25 degrees below zero, to be specific. At recent constituency meetings in each of my communities, residents brought me their concerns on these matters. They also brought forward their ideas for improvements. Residents would like to see schools equipped with backup generators so that communities have guaranteed warming centres. They're also seeking assurance from the Housing Corporation that plans are in place to prevent pipes from freezing in public housing units and private homes as well. For example, when the Fort McPherson power plant was destroyed, many residents stayed warm by visiting friends and family members whose homes were heated by wood stoves. An inventory of firewood-fueled homes could also be a valuable asset. All these issues could be addressed in well-developed, up-to-date community emergency plans. Such plans could also help communities plan for a wide range of potential emergencies, not only cold weather crisis. I'd like to engage a minister to help my communities take the necessary next steps to develop or update their emergency plans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll have questions later today.
Merci. Member statement. Member Goodman and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Since our fall sitting, two important N.W.T climate change events took place. The draft climate change strategic framework was finally released on January 3rd of this year, and regular MLAs met with the Auditor General and N.W.T officials to discuss the audit on N.W.T climate change. The audit found, and I quote, ENR did not develop a territorial strategy to adapt to climate change. ENR did not fulfill its commitment to provide departments and communities with information needed to take action on climate change. The territorial greenhouse gas emission or gas study did not have a significant impact on reducing emission levels, and ENR did not address long-standing deficiency affecting its leadership on climate change. ENR provided its draft action plan in response to the audit literally a day and a half before the Standing Committee public hearing on the matter. That's in breach of at least 2 consensus government process conventions. The audit action plan went as far as to claim that the climate change strategic framework addresses all of the audit recommendations. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's almost no mention of carbon pricing and the role that will play in our international and national obligations on climate change. Both the framework and the audit action plan neglect to say why ENR continues to fail in its leadership role on climate change or to propose specific policy or structural changes. When the Auditor General did his work, ENR was down to 2 staff on climate change. I'm calling on this government to make climate change a real priority, develop and introduce a Climate Change Act, or at least a cabinet-approved policy that gives ENR the authority to implement the framework. Make climate change a part of Financial Management Board submissions and reviews. Establish a ministerial roundtable on climate change to show real leadership and get industry buy-in. And finally, give ENR the resources to actually do the work. I'll have questions later today for the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ikegodan and then Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have spoken before in this House on the need for the N.W.T. to implement a guaranteed basic income pilot in the life of this Assembly. Whether it is a way to address income disparity or prepare for major changes in our economy, this innovative policy initiative is not only the right course for a government to take, but in all reality, an inevitable change we will have to implement, even if this government chooses to remain idle and continue supporting paternalistic and punitive income support programs. I've used historical examples of Dauphin, Manitoba, but now have something more contemporary for this government to take note of, the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. The province of Ontario is among several areas of the world that is pursuing a basic income project, including Finland, which began a 2-year pilot last January. The 3-year pilot project in Ontario, which began in Hamilton and Thunder Bay last summer and in Lindsay last fall, is testing whether unconditional cash support can boost health, education, and housing for people on social assistance or earning low wages. Information gleaned from the 3 communities will guide future provincial policy on how to better support all Ontarians living in poverty. How it works is that individuals chosen are part of the first wave of participants in this pilot project, with basic income received on a monthly, no-strings-attached payment of up to $1,400 for people living in poverty, with those with disabilities receive an additional $500 a month. This amount remains fixed no matter an individual's living conditions, which is a change on how the Ontario Works Payment, the province's welfare program for people without disabilities, where a person can have their benefits reduced based on if they have shelter or work. Mr. Speaker, 3,000 people have been enrolled so far. The province hopes to recruit another 6,000 participants, with 4,000 who will receive a basic income, fill out surveys, and participate in focus groups as part of the study. A further 2,000 won't go into the monthly payments, but will be paid to complete surveys and tracked as a control group. Though they will need more time to properly analyze the full results of this ongoing pilot project, the initial result has been overwhelmingly positive and is achieving exactly what was intended: boosting health, improving prospects for better education, and housing for people living in poverty. Let us begin experimenting with the same kind of guaranteed basic income pilot, because if these results rendered initially, it would seem to be a policy that Northerners living in poverty could benefit from. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ikegodan and then Member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I raised the issues of community land tenure and the understanding on how this ensures program qualifications for recipients in my writing. Mr. Speaker, this calendar year, and more specifically last week, the Department of Land sponsored community engagements in Fort Good Hope and Toledo. The Department of MACA and Finance will participate to share information on the property assessment, taxation regimes, collection systems, etc. Understanding land tenure ensures benefits to residents and the seniors of the Sahtu for the variety of housing programs. Mr. Speaker, modernizing our current legislation is a prudent and responsible function of land management and administration. And most importantly, community consultation with stakeholders contributes towards transparency and public engagement. Mr. Speaker, later I will have questions to the Minister of Lands. Mussy.
Mussy. Member statements. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, February 21st, 2018, the Q-Tsen Zeding Hai Note Kutu Zedangdi. Yoloni Ding, Kala Dutsen Kaneth, Massi. Kutuela Sia, indeed, Deke, Job. Kutuela, then the targeting at the onsen targeting. Go who came at it in the day. Then a Kelly Idlia, I don't do that at the right da. Go cho, na head des one. Who please get it? I see clear shoot at teeth and killer. Good silly, illen go dene, sagot at it. Illen is you go cho. Who leads Sagere day with an all shoot the horn, then a sad day. On can shoe, then it's easy. Condits an onsen could tweet our sagutin. If the could tweet then a tar jagutia, who lead a dondida then eat link water, na he naho with the goodlia job. Sihare can a thing like could tweet the sent then a nugget war. Nugget say, Museum go gain this on the Guara go near Guara good agi night says on the Hare Museum no Jonathan, on shoe, a Jean, you cashu could use around dealer Nathan la. So then again done it there, then a net the hunt again either. Say to curiously cure it is shortly in that alkali lake, did then a hare. I don't like go chocolate, the queen, Kukudi, the will leak it, the Dajiki Alagin da. The Q show wine Dagutsian, the alkali lake, I don't do that, Nahi Hare, Nahe Cho, Nahotien, New Zungudi, will lean at one Kaninija. That's a journey day, New Zunguts and Diani day, a la natas at the top, Gora, Tlitsingare, Guts in Ditsiti, is you can't send. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Inuvik Bootleek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great honor to have some of our students from the Aurora College here joining us today and taking in the proceedings. I believe every year students from the social work program come and learn about the how the Legislative Assembly works. I believe they got a great tour this morning, so I'd just like to welcome the students and the instructor from Aurora College social work program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to also recognize Susan Fitzke. She is the instructor at Aurora College with the social work program, and she's also a constituent of Yellowknife North. Welcome to the gallery.
Merci. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Danita Frost-Airy, originally from McClavic. She is here in Yellowknife as part of the social work program at Aurora College. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Colleagues, I'd like to draw your attention to presence in the gallery. Ms. Emily Durhan. Ms. Durhan is joining us on attachment from Legislative Assembly of Prince Edward Island and will be at our table for the next 3 weeks. Welcome to the Northwest Territories and to our Assembly. And of course, colleagues, draw your attention to visitors in gallery as well, to all the students that are here with us today and also the instructor. More specifically, Candace Apples from N.W.T as part of the social work program at Aurora College. I'd like to say welcome, and it's always nice to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Merci. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. One of the takeaways from the 2017 investigation by the Information and Privacy Commissioner into the privacy breach at the Untitled Hospital is that it was almost certainly avoidable if the recommendations from the 2012 investigation had been acted on. In an effort to ensure there's action on the problem this time, I'm looking for information on the implementation of the 2017 recommendations. My question is, who's in charge of privacy issues at the Untitled Hospital, and who does that person report to? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a number of things have happened since 2012, including the introduction of the Health Information Act, which is actually an item that was recommended by the Privacy Commissioner. With that new act, we have done a number of things. We have set up a number of new privacy policies, and those have been put in place basically since May 2017. And they follow up on recommendations of the Privacy Commissioner, but are also consistent with things that we need to do under the Act. And those focus on things like privacy breaches and the requirement for privacy impact assessments, the requirement for mandatory training, as well as how to utilize mobile devices within the system. In addition, Mr. Speaker, we have put in a new public awareness campaign and materials about the client's rights. It's important that the clients understand their rights. And what information they can access, what information is how information is used. Since the incident that the member referred to in Inuvik, since June 2015, the department has delivered over 57 territorial-wide health information training sessions for over 373 staff. And this is on top of the training that's done at a local level for local staff. Beginning this year, this winter, 2018, there are some new privacy training modules in place that will be delivered to all health and social services employees in order to meet our mandatory training requirement. We have also hired a new territorial risk manager who has one role, one of their roles is to develop and implement programs and policies that will mitigate risk and improve the overall health privacy across the entire Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the Kidadea Cassie member, Yellowknife Center.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his response. I'd like to ask specifically at the Inuvik Hospital, the breakdown was privacy wasn't anyone's job. So I'm going to repeat my question. Who is in charge of privacy at the hospital, and who does that person report to? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have the territorial risk manager, as I've indicated. We also have a territorial health information director or manager. At a local level, all employees are in fact custodians and have a responsibility under the Health Information Act. Ultimately, in every one of our regional offices, the COOs have a responsibility to ensure that all of their staff are properly trained and have a clear understanding of their obligations under the Health Information Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadadea Cassie member, Yellowknife Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to know from the Minister what restrictions are now in place in Inuvik within the electronic record system to limit access to the records based on the actual job the person does at the hospital. Mussy.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, every individual is getting trained. Many of the individuals in the Nunavik regional office, the Nunavik Health and Social Services region, have been trained. They understand their roles and responsibilities. There are limitations on what individuals can see through our medical records, and we are ensuring that our people have the training and understand their roles and responsibilities under the Health Information Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, N.W.T. Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Mussy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Health Minister has demonstrated that he has let's say, heightened understanding of the importance of privacy, and that's reflected in Inuvik and elsewhere. Can he tell us, with respect to the privacy breach in Hay River, whether the same safeguards are in place there? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the situation in Hay River and Inuvik were different. And as we roll out the Health Information Act, we get out and train. Also, as we move forward with a single authority, what is clear is that in the past, not all authorities have applied rules as consistently or the same as others. Having a single authority has really given us an opportunity to make sure that our rules and our procedures and our territorial legislation is being applied consistently. The Hay River situation, as I said, was slightly different than the Inuvik situation. The data that was in question wasn't the same type of data, and it wasn't the breach wasn't the same. We take both of them very, very seriously. We have been in touch with patients where affected. We have made sure that the employees understand where they had possibly breached the legislation, and we are making sure that they have the training. We need to make sure that in every corner of the Northwest Territories, in every office, every health delivery agency, that they understand the roles, and that's why we're requiring everybody to have the mandatory training, which we're rolling out as we speak. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nikada Karen, the member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to follow up on my member statement today, and my questions are for the Minister of E&R. My first question, does the Aurora Pellet plan to use the tree cuttings and the tops in addition to the timber itself to make these wood pellets, or will these cuttings and tops be burnt at the sites where they are being cut? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the full utilization of trees on the harvest system used by Aurora wood pellets, this level of detail has not been provided to ENR yet. Pre-harvest prescriptions will determine what happens to tree tops scattered on site. So as soon as we have more information to pass on, and if it is the wish of committee, we can keep them informed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nikada Cassie, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. And I think probably the Standing Committee would probably wish to see that. My second question is, I understand that more than 3.5 million hectares of forests have been burnt in recent years, leaving behind large tracts of dry and boreal forest. Of course, much of it is in the South Mackenzie region. Using this timber might be environmentally better source for Aurora pellet operations. Has the company considered this, and if so, what would the results of this consideration? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yes, it has been considered. The economic viability and life cycle analysis reports on utilizing burned wood has been provided to Aurora wood pellets and forest management agreement holders, where the viability of using burned wood declines over time, but it has been considered. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Tada Cassie, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the department's thinking forward and actually providing that information. And I understand, as you know, time goes on, these trees decay. So my third question is, how did overall greenhouse gas emissions figure into the permitting process for Aurora wood pellet projects, including the timber cutting permits? If this impact was determined, please tell us what it is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was a little too quick there. Reports have been commissioned by ENR looking at greenhouse gas emissions and the forest industry. The substitution of fossil fuels with woody biomass in the Northwest Territories, and they demonstrate significant reductions in greenhouse gas emission when utilizing woody biomass. N.W.T sees this industry as environmentally sustainable while also offering N.W.T. residents potential savings on heating costs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, no dere kasi member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the minister's answer and the department working on this project. So my final question is, in regards to wood pellets that are being burnt now to heat many GNW2 buildings, how are the greenhouse gas savings calculated? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, wood pellets are now burned at many GNWT buildings, but we don't have this information at our fingertips as to the gas savings or greenhouse gas savings calculated. The information would need to be confirmed. I'll work with my colleague at the Department of Infrastructure. If it's the wish of committee, then we'll be able to give them an update. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. The Auditor General found that ENR failed to lead GNWT efforts on climate change. The recent climate change strategic framework and the action plan in response to the audit continue in that tradition by not proposing any policy, legislative, or structural changes. Can the Minister explain to this House why his department continues to fail in its leadership role on climate change? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I disagree wholeheartedly with the member. The department has not failed in its leadership role. In fact, we're doing a lot of work. I think the Auditor General even made comment to the work we did. Some of the work that they were doing was before the work that we did. And we are using the recommendations from the Office of the Auditor General to strengthen our role. They did look at a defined period of time and did not consider all the good work that's being done to develop a climate change strategic framework. And the document is a roadmap as to how the N.W.T. will address and respond to climate change up to 2030. The department also plays a leadership role in the implementation of the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change and the Northern Adaptation Strategy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Yes, the Minister is right. It was for a defined period of time, but I quoted the Auditor General directly from the report. I wasn't making that up. I want to give the Minister, though, an opportunity to talk about the good work the Department's doing. So what specific policy, legislative, or structural changes is the Minister proposing to ensure that his Department can fulfill its leadership role on climate change? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've done a lot of work on this, and I believe I've given committee an update on the carbon price and climate change strategic framework. I believe we still need to come before committee if it's a wish of committee, or we could do 11 independent briefings if they choose to as well. But we continue to work on that. We are looking forward to coming forward with some changes and to strengthen our adaptation to climate change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Well, I gave the Minister an opportunity to provide some specifics on policy, legislative, structural changes, and he didn't take me up on the offer. So when the Auditor General conducted the climate change audit, ENR was down to 2 staff on this file. How could we allow that to happen? Can the Minister explain what he is doing to convince his colleague, the Minister of Finance, to secure the resources necessary to properly implement the actions to allow us to meet our international and national obligations with regard to climate change? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very difficult to get money out of the Minister of Finance. The ENR will be rolling out a proposed adaptation planning program to assist communities to prepare, plan, and implement measures to address climate change. The enhanced program also has a dedicated PY and resources to assist community. Also, as part of the development of a 5-year action plan, the department will be looking at what resources are required for implementation and federal funding opportunities. So if there's opportunities to access some federal funding, obviously we'll be looking at those, and at the same time we'll be making investments of our own through the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, non de Acadie, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for those good news stories, but he still hasn't talked about anything concrete that he's prepared to do to make sure that his department has the proper authority to take on this leadership role. So let's get really specific here. I do want to say something nice about the framework. It finally sets a target for industrial emissions, for greenhouse gas emissions, but to try to continue to send staff to try to secure industry buy-in, that's not the kind of leadership I think we need on this file. So will the minister commit to an ongoing roundtable with industry leaders, NGOs, and other stakeholders to help lead the implementation of the climate change strategic framework? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of the Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe we have had we've had a lot of work that was done on this, some regional meetings in a number of the communities, as I pointed out the other day. We've had meetings with industry and got their feedback. Again, I would be, as we proceed further into the, closer to the implementation, it is imperative that I work with provide committee with information and get some feedback from committee. But I can assure the member and the public that ENR is taking a leadership role on this, and we want to make sure that we have a product that's the best one we can do for the people in Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, follow-up to my member's statement, I have a few questions for the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs. MACA offers community emergency planning workshops. How can the communities of Aklavik, Fort McPherson, and Sigitchik work with the department to see these workshops delivered within the next 4 to 6 months? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the member statement, he used the term, I believe it was, MACA is always there to help. That's his term. And I really appreciate that, and I agree. MACA's whole job is to help communities. So how do we get the emergency planning into the areas of his region? Simple. Need to get the community government to contact the regional manager. At that point, we'll get a facilitator to come in and help them actually either develop or update their emergency planning community emergency plans. We also provide tabletop exercises that they can take advantage of if they're interested in that, which will help to validate and make sure that they're on track for their plans. I should state as well that we actually were just into Fort McPherson last week, and we have just worked with them, and so they are in the process of drafting their updated emergency plan. So we're more than willing to help, and I appreciate the member's comment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akira Cassie, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister touched on this a bit, but what other resources can MACA offer to small communities taking on emergency planning? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as meeting with the communities face-to-face, we have online training that is available to communities. The online training in this case are particular basic emergency management and the incident command systems. Those are the two courses that we start with to develop a community emergency plan. So those are online. We also work one-on-one with communities. If they need our assistance, we'll come in and we'll help them either create or update their plans. And we have tabletop exercises that we'll go in and we'll actually do a draft or a draft emergency plan to make sure that they have the right responses and that their plan is updated. So those are the things that we can do to work with communities. And like I said earlier, just contact the regional superintendent, have the community governments contact the regional superintendents, and we will be more than happy to help the communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadade, Cassie, Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When communities work on developing or updating their emergency plans, can MACA act as a liaison to other departments and territorial agencies, for example, to help communities install backup generators in local schools or other gathering centres? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Often MLAs often say to us, just say yes. In this case, I'm going to just say yes. We will actually work with them. Part of the working and developing an emergency plan is having discussions on what resources are needed and what funding sources they have available. So the regional superintendents, the management team will work directly with the communities, and we can also act as a liaison to work with other departments that they may need to access services from. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the answer is yes.
Merci. Oral question, Hikadaia County, Member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following up on my member statement for the Minister of Lands, the list of Sahtu community engagements of last week's schedule included Fort Good Hope and Toledo. My first question is there any plans for similar engagements in the community of Colville Lake and Delaney? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been information sessions which have already taken place in Fort Providence on the 19th of February and in Fort Good Hope on February 20th. A meeting was scheduled to be held on Toledo on February 22nd, but was canceled due to a weather advisory, and that meeting will be rescheduled as soon as possible. I'm not sure if the department is planning on visiting other communities, but I could certainly take that up with the department and get back to the member opposite. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Hikadaia Cassie, Member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll go back to my question here, and if the Toledo community was canceled due to my understanding that there was some storms there, will that community be put on the list of Colville and Delaney for similar engagements? If so, can the Minister provide me a proposed tentative date? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, unfortunately, the meeting could not take place in Toledo. It is definitely going to be put back on the list, and I will provide the member opposite with the date once that is ascertained. I can't give him an answer with respect to the other communities, but I know they will be going back to Toledo. Thank you.
Oral question, Tadade, Cassie, Member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I trust the Minister will follow up on providing me that information to carry on with the community engagement. After all, there's been quite an investment put into scheduling one. My next question, will the Minister confirm willingness through the Sahtu bilateral agreement dated June the 25th, 2015 for a joint shared collaboration on land officers? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have the details of the joint of the Sahtu bilateral before me, but I could certainly get back to the Minister with respect to that question. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Cassie, Member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that reply, and we'll follow up. My last question is, will the Sahtu see another round of engagements regarding the proposed multiple amendments to the N.W.T. Lands Act, as well as the Commissioner's Lands Act? And they're related to the previous questions on that similar note. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Speaker, I understand there has been extensive engagement with the communities with respect to these two pieces of legislation which are being updated. I don't think we were contemplating another round of engagements, but if we are, I will certainly inform the member opposite. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Nikada Cannon, the member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My member statement, I talked about the early results of the Ontario Basic Income Project, pilot project. Some of the comments from people in the program, it's giving me back my independence. I don't feel backed into a corner. If I want to eat, I can afford to buy something instead of going to a food bank or a soup kitchen. These are the kind of progressive policies that are moving the working poor forward in the province of Ontario. The Minister of Education, Culture and Employment speak to any analysis his department has done on a guaranteed basic income pilot for the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we are aware of the pilot program that's going on currently going on in Ontario. I believe it started up in June of 2017, and the department is closely looking at that pilot program. In the meantime, we continue to make enhancements to our income assistance programs here in the Northwest Territories. We want to make sure that all our families, Northerners, do have the basic food, clothing, help them with rent and other expenses. And as we're reviewing this pilot project, we're continuing to support our clients that are on income assistance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the Canada Cassie member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the issue is not do we support those in poverty, those experiencing poverty through these programs. It's the nature of these programs that are, as one of my honorable friends mentioned, a poverty trap. Once you get in the system, you can't get out. You know, is the minister's clearly looking at this, but does he have any plans to move forward on it, on a guaranteed income pilot project for the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned, can't make any commitments until we see the review of these results with the pilot program going in Ontario. I did look over the program, though, but some of the things that they're doing is things that we do right across the departments with Health and Social Services, with Justice, within my department. And one of the programs that we also have that's similar to what they're doing in Ontario is with our Productive Choices programs that we have with our income assistance clients. But I can't commit to any kind of guaranteed income pilot until we see what's happening in Ontario. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Canada Cassie member Cam Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the Ontario pilot project is just one of many that's taking place in the world. We've had them happen in Canada before, but I'll ask the minister. You mentioned the productive choices. How is that similar to a basic income pilot? How is it achieving the same results? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And some of our productive choices is trying to help people come out of poverty. So education, counseling, volunteering, where we're encouraging our income assistance clients to participate in a productive choice as they receive income from the N.W.T in my department, but we're also trying to help them get out of poverty by getting the counseling that they need, looking at also getting the skills and training that they need through education, and volunteering in their community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Untitled Chapter member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one thing we're learning from these pilot projects, this basic guaranteed income, is that the best way to help someone get out of poverty is to ensure that their cost of living is taken care of without a lot of strings attached or government oversight. It allows them to get a job. It allows them to pay for food. Right now, we're clawing back a lot of income. So, I mean, I just don't understand what the holdup is. Can we take a sample size of recipients of income support and start modeling this kind of effort, even on a temporary basis. So it's a low-cost approach that still gets better results than we're currently experiencing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And our client service officers do a great job of meeting with our clients to ensure that they're up to date on their productive choices, but also make sure that they're actively seeking to get employment and getting the services that they need, as well as counseling that they need. So I believe we're already doing some of that work with our income assistance programs. We're going to wait until this pilot project is complete with Ontario, but we are closely monitoring to see how that's impacting residents in Ontario, and if that's something that we can possibly look at here in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canada, Member Deschaux.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier in my language I spoke about how last week on February 21st, 2018 marked 8 years of sobriety for me. So I wanted to take the moment thank you, colleagues. I wanted to take the moment just to extend my appreciation and gratitude for the many professionals that have come across my path that weren't judgmental and were basically just professional and compassionate and believing in the service that they provide to the public. And my heart is wholeheartedly felt for those people that go beyond the call of duty and provide a service to society in general. So merci to all of them. My questions are to the Minister of Health and Social Services. In terms of taking the step of sobering up, what kind of help does the department provide in terms of program and services for people that could be ready to help themselves to sober up and change their lives? Merci.
Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a result of the Mental Health and Addictions Forum that was held a number of years ago, what we heard clearly from the people across the Northwest Territories is that they want options. So we're trying to provide as many options and many different alternatives for individuals to begin that healing journey as possible. At a community level, in most of our communities, we have mental health and addictions counselors or other counselors that are available through NGOs and other partners. Thank goodness they're out there. We have treatment facilities that are available to us in Southern Canada that provide a wide range in a program that could never be delivered in one facility. I think we need to be really proud of the fact that we're working with our Indigenous governments across the Northwest Territories for the delivery of on-the-land programming that are designed by the Aboriginal governments for their people. We also provide wellness dollars to every community in the Northwest Territories who design their own wellness plans. Many of them are focusing on healing opportunities for the residents. So we're working to provide as many many options as we can. We always need to do more. We're coming forward with a new action plan. We're looking for some feedback from committee. I know the committee is putting something together for us. So we're looking forward to seeing that so that we can make more enhancement and improvements as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Canada, Cassie, Member Deschaux.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister did state that there is ongoing initiatives in terms of working with Indigenous governments, and I'd like to commend the Minister for taking those steps to working with all of our communities in terms of placing in all far reaches of the N.W.T. on the land programs and initiatives. And my question is, the first understanding that on the land programs, what was called for from previous assessments is that people wanted options, and that's one option. Whether and how traditional beliefs of Dene are reflected on the land programs. Merci.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we heard clearly from many people across the Northwest Territories that on-the-land and traditional healing is incredibly important to them. And it is certainly for many people part of the process that they're going to go through as they proceed down their healing journey. There's a lot of questions about on-the-land healing programs. There really hasn't been an evaluation mechanism, but we have worked with our Indigenous partners here in the Northwest Territories to start the development of an evaluation framework so that we can see and try to assess some of the value. Anecdotally, obviously, we hear many great and important things about the on-the-land programs that are out there. I will say that every one of the programs is different because they are designed by our regional Aboriginal governments. We as a government don't tell people how to design these programs. I feel like we're the wrong people to tell the Indigenous governments how to design the programs because they are from the people, for the people. We do make our staff available if asked. We want to be partners. We want to help. We continue to work with our Aboriginal partners to make sure that they have the resources to do this important work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one observation that I have is back in the day, we had in every community alcohol and drug workers, as they call them. And my understanding, their approach was in addressing the root of the alcohol issues. They treated the whole issue of alcohol as a disease. Now we have mental health workers that more likely take almost an approach of that every person that deals with alcohol has some trauma in their background. So besides that, how has the philosophy of treating alcohol changed over the years with the department? Masi.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the whole treatment methodology around addictions has continued to evolve over the years. For many years ago, it was believed that basically the 12-step program was one of the best sources, but we're starting to hear a lot more that there's other new approaches, more scientific, more medical-based systems that we need to be exploring. We're hoping to and intending to explore this as we move forward with the next Addictions Recovery Action Plan. A number of years ago, the member is correct, we had addictions counselors in the community. Before my time, and certainly before the member's time, I do believe this changed where we brought in mental health and addictions counselors instead, recognizing that some of the individuals who are struggling with addictions may have mental health issues, but that doesn't suggest that everybody who has an addictions issue has a mental health issue. But we wanted to make sure, rather the system wanted to make sure that we were providing a full range of services to individuals who are struggling, whether it's a mental health issue or an addiction issue, or in some cases, both. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister stated there's an effort that the department is undertaking, primarily that he's working on the development of an action plan. Could the minister highlight his immediate priority in seeing the success of the action plan in addressing alcohol issues in N.W.T? Masi.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I had an opportunity to travel with members of the Standing Committee as they toured different facilities in the Northwest Territory, in Southern Canada. I think we had a lot of good discussion. I think we learned an awful lot from that experience. And as far as setting a priority for the next action plan, I do want to be cautious. I don't want to presuppose what's going to be in that document. We still have some work to do. We still have feedback coming from committee. I think all of that is going to be incredibly important to help us have an informed discussion and set our priorities moving forward. We do know that there is a need to explore other alternatives and to think outside of the traditional box, looking more at medical or scientific sort of responses to addiction, not just relying on things like the 12-step program. We got to continue to explore harm reduction as an option for providing our residents with more and effective tools. But I don't want to presuppose exactly what this document is going to look like. I haven't received the committee's report yet. But I am looking forward to working together to put together a document that's going to meet the needs of residents moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Canada, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier today I spoke about the importance of the government's response to the calls to action relating to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. And so my questions today are for the Premier. The Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs about a year ago did provide this House an update on the status of the calls to action as it relates to our government. And so some of the questions I have might be a little bit cross-departmental. I'll try to keep them as general as possible. And see what kind of replies I can get from the Premier. And so last year, when the government, when the department reported on its responses to the TRC's calls to action, one of the major goals was to close the education gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, Mr. Speaker. So can the Premier advise the Assembly how graduation rates are unfolding, and does he feel that the government is in fact closing this education gap? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Education is one of the most important priorities of this government, and I think the Truth and Reconciliation report certainly confirmed that and made some concrete recommendations which we have embraced. In 2015, the gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students was reflected in the fact that 67% of non-Aboriginal students graduated compared to 56% of Aboriginal students. So obviously we have a ways to go to improve on that. The major initiative that the Government of Northwest Territories is using to narrow the gap is the N.W.T. Education Renewal Initiative, which is a 4-year program running and focusing or looking at areas for action in the areas of language and cultural identity, student and education well-being, teaching and learning, and system accountability. And I think one of the ways that I look at as to whether the gap is narrowing is I know that we have more and more post-secondary Aboriginal students. I think the fact that that number is in the hundreds and certainly is a reflection on the improvement in the education services and the narrowing of the gap. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Kidda Day, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Premier for the fulsome answer. I do appreciate that. A lot of the aspects around that question were relevant to the Department of Education, Culture and Employment, so I'm grateful for that fulsome and detailed answer. Mr. Speaker, on health, the government is building a team of community wellness planners and a series of community healthy living fairs. Of course, it's to promote healthy living and nutrition and fitness at the community level. Can the Premier advise if these wellness fairs have all taken place, and if so, how are we measuring the success of these fairs? Are they having a positive impact? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to report that the community wellness fairs are proceeding. They're going very well. The most recent ones were in N.W.T, and they also at the N.W.T Association of Communities AGM, they brought in some of their props, and you could walk through a colon, so that you can get people to go get checked out for colon cancer. And I think the most important message is to people is prevention, and that people are the ones that can, if they practice prevention, they'll be healthier. And I think a large part of the measurement will be how healthy our people are going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Day, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the Premier for his replies. I'd like to maybe now direct the attention a little bit to our own GNWT employees. I recognize that all GNW employees are required to undergo Aboriginal cultural awareness training, and maybe can the Premier advise if all GNWT employees have now taken this training, and if so, is the training provided continually, like to reflect turnover and maybe movement within the public service? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to say that the Truth and Reconciliation Committee recognized the Government of the Northwest Territories for its leadership in not only cultural awareness, but also the fact that residential schools, the history of residential schools, and also our land claims negotiations are curriculum. So we focused on mandatory training for students and educators, and so that's been our main priority. Our expectation is that we will eventually have all of our employees undertaking cultural awareness training, and we'll continue. Right now, we'll focus on new employees as they come on board, and we have hiring a consultant to review and update our Indigenous cultural awareness training program, and I think that it's certainly very important for our public services to understand when they're delivering programs and services to both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nunderea Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank you to the Premier for his detailed reply. Much appreciated. I mentioned public outreach events such as those sponsored by the City of Edmonton. That was an example that I used. They were designed to engage the public on culture and history and to educate them about treaties and just how to celebrate the historic contributions of First Nations. And so has our government considered creating similar events in the North, particularly in the larger centres where maybe more non-Indigenous Northerners could participate? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government has even gone above and beyond that. Instead of a special event day, we have a statutory holiday called Aboriginal Day, where everybody gets one day off a year if you're working for the government of Northwest Territories, where you can learn about Aboriginal history and culture, and also you can go out and participate, and Aboriginal people can celebrate the fact that they're Aboriginal. Also, we provide funding to those Aboriginal groups that want to participate on Aboriginal Day, and we're always looking for ways to promote that. And I think the fact that over 50% of our population is Aboriginal, you can just drive down the road and participate in Aboriginal events that are put on by Aboriginal governments on a regular basis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Hikere Cannon, the member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a few follow-up questions to the Minister of ENR on my member statement here. So can the Minister tell us, a lot of communities are looking at fire smarting their projects, so has the department encouraged the communities to look at working with the company to use this excess material for building, making pallets? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, specific discussions with the communities haven't happened yet, but this has been identified as an opportunity. It does make sense that if there's opportunities there to use wood that's already been cut, then we should explore that. But the actual discussions haven't happened with the communities yet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akira Cassie, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. So I guess my next question is, how would the greenhouse gas savings calculations change if pellets burnt were made from green lumber? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the report looking at greenhouse gas savings were based on utilizing green timber. It is generally understood that utilizing dead wood yields greater greenhouse gas savings than green wood, and the fact that the wood pellets that are out there, I believe they have to have a specific moisture content, and I looked it up on the Environment Canada website, and I believe it has to have a specific moisture content. So obviously they do dry. My understanding is they dry the pellets and not utilize green as much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My last final question in regards to this topic here today is, what limits has the ENR established overall to the annual sustainable harvest of forests such for the south and west of the Great Slave Lake? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the annual sustainable harvest level for the inventoried areas in the South Slave and Decho combined is approximately 500,000 cubic meters per year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have some additional questions about privacy following on from the ones that I asked before. Is the minister able to tell me what percentage of the N.W.T. Health and Social Services Authority staff have been trained in privacy training? I'll just start with that one. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't have that information at the tip of my tongue. I will get in touch with the department. We will provide that detail to the member in committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that commitment by the minister, and I would ask him to include Clecho Community Services Agency and the Hay River Health Authority as well. I'm wondering about the audits of usage of the electronic medical record system. Is there a regular audit procedure in place? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated in my previous responses, we do have some new positions that have been put in place to do this type of analysis and put the policies around that. I can't say for certain exactly what those processes are today, but once again, I will get that information for the committee and the member.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the minister for that. Has the minister considered reporting to this House and to the public on these issues of training and audits and other things that would strengthen our confidence in the ability of the Health Authority to keep our information private? Merci.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if that is the wish of committee, I'm certainly happy to explore that within the department to see what we can do within our existing legislation. I obviously want the members to be comfortable with the information, but more importantly, I want the public to be comfortable. So if that's the wish of committee, I'll certainly explore it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the minister for that. So when the minister says the wish of the committee, is he looking for direction in a letter from the Standing Committee on Social Development, for example? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. I enjoy working with committee. I look forward for their feedback and input, and I think a letter from the committee would be helpful in helping to move that initiative forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioners' opening address. Replies to Commissioners' opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Reports on Committee on the Review of Bills. Member Cam-Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to report to the Assembly that the Standing Committee on Government Operations has reviewed Bill 1, Western Canada Lottery Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill establishes the Northwest Territories Lottery Commission. It also establishes the Physical Activity Sport and Recreation Fund, a special purpose fund that will receive proceeds from the operation of lotteries by the Western Canada Lottery Corporation. The Commission is responsible for the conduct, management, and operation of lotteries. The Minister will administer the fund and distribute proceeds for limited purposes, including the promotion and delivery of physical activity, sport, and recreation programs. A public clause-by-clause review of the bill took place earlier this afternoon. With that, Mr. Speaker, the committee wishes to report that Bill 1 is now ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. And Mr. Speaker, committee will be presenting a substantive report on Bill 1 to this House tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reports on Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports on Committee on the Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled 2015-2016 Traditional Knowledge Annual Report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Minister of Public Utilities Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the following document entitled the 2017 Annual Report, Public Utilities Board of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Wednesday, February 28, 2018, I will move that Bill 6, Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Implementation Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Motions. Motions, first reading bills. Second reading bills. Second reading bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 1-18.3. Minister Statement 19-18.3. Minister Statement 32-18.3 and Table Document 63-18.3 with member by authority given to me as Speaker by motion 7-18-3, I hereby authorize the House to sit beyond the daily hour of adjournment to consider the business before the House with member Hay River North in a chair.
I now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, committee would like to consider table document 63-18 brackets 3 main estimates 2018-2019 with the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment as the department under consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will consider the document after a brief recess. I will now call Committee of the Whole back to order. Committee, we have agreed to consider table document 63-18(3), main estimates 2018-2019, the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment. This department begins on page 203. I will first turn to the minister responsible for any opening comments. Do you have any opening comments, Minister Schuman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to present the 2018-19 main estimates for the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment. Overall, the department's estimates is proposing an increase of $1.97 million, or 3.5% over the 2017-18 main estimates. They include approved adjustments of $1.2 million in total to fund the Freight Cost Assistance Program for fishers, the Mining Incentive Program, contracting in relation to the development of the Mineral Resource Act, funding for French language communication services. Our proposed estimates also include $100,000 for the Northwest Territories Geological Survey to share the costs of establishing and populating a permafrost database. This cost will be offset by revenue which will be received from the Government of Canada. To respond to increasing demand to the tourism sector, the 2018-19 main estimates includes force growth of $143,000 for a new manager of tourism development and enforcement position in the North Slave region. An additional $588,000 in new funding is being proposed to support the implementation of the new agriculture strategy, fund a 2-year support officer for fishing sector in the South Slave, and as we continue to implement the mineral development strategy for prospector training, the resource energy development initiative, information initiative, and the development of the regional mineral development strategy. The 2018-19 main estimates reflect sunsets of $420,000 related to the implementation of French language services, an administrator for the Satu Oil and Gas Business Development, business coordinator under the Mineral Development Strategy, and hardware costs and database updates for the Northwest Territories Geological Survey. As we plan for the up-and-coming fiscal year, the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment remains committed to meeting the priorities of the late 18th Legislative Assembly. We will be fulfilling commitments that we have made to introduce an N.W.T manufacturing strategy and a strategy for the development of the N.W.T petroleum resources. We will also be investing in the implementation of strategies introduced last year to grow the agriculture sector and revitalize the commercial fishing on Great Slave Lake. We will continue to implement the mineral development strategy, and most notably in the drafting of the new Mineral Resource Act and introduction of amendments to the Mineral Resource Regulations. Of the department's total proposed budget, 58.5% has been allocated to economic diversification, business support, and tourism, with 27.5% identified for spending in the area of minerals and petroleum resources. This concludes my opening remarks, and I welcome questions from members. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. I understand you have witnesses you wish to bring into the chamber. Sergeant at Arms, will you please escort the witnesses into the chamber? Minister, you may take your seat at the witness table. Minister, would you please introduce your witnesses for the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On my left, I have Julie Moitchin, Director of Finance, and on my right, I have Deputy Minister Tom Jensen.
Thank you, Minister. Committee, previously we have agreed to forego opening comments. Does committee agree to again forego the opening comments for this department? Thank you, committee. This department consists of 4 activities. Each member will be allowed to speak once for 10 minutes to each activity, and again to the departmental summary, as well as the 4 information items as a whole at the end of the section. The departmental total can be found on page 207. As usual, we will forego that until discussion of the activities, beginning with corporate management on pages 210 to 213. We have questions or comments from committee on the section corporate management? I'll give committee a moment. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed I'm on page 211. I've noticed that, corporate costs from the previous budget has gone down. Can the minister explain where this changes come from? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a decrease of $28K. The decrease is a result of the interactivity reallocation to finance and administration to fund the Hay River Area Corporate Service Office Clerk, previously cost-shared with ENR. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could the minister please elaborate further in regards to that cost-sharing position? Thank you. Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This previous position was cost-shared between ITI and the Department of ENR, and we've moved to a new location now, so this is fully funded from within ITI. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Further on to the directorate, we see a reduction of about $55,000. Can the minister expand on this reduction? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This was primarily, not all of it, but primarily because of the reduction of the executive assistant position to the ADM. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can the minister please tell us if this position was actually filled at this time, or was this a vacant position? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it was vacant.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going further down, it says Finance and Administration. We see an increase of approximately about $142,000. Can the minister expand on why we see an increase in this area? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's right. It's $142K. The increase relates to an interdepartmental reallocation to fund a full-time occupational health and safety specialist and an area corporate services clerk for Hay River. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you. Can the minister expand on the health and occupational safety position? Is that allocated in a regional center, or is that a headquarter position that looks after the territories? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is based out of Yellowknife, and this is for occupational health and safety, as I've said there in my previous comment, and this is something that we've internally funded within our department. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the minister for that. I just need clarification. Is this position going to be for the territories, or is this going to be specifically for Yellowknife? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's specifically for ITI, but it's for all regions in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, and I'd like to applaud the department for doing that. I think it's much needed, and for the territories, I think this is the first good step. So my last question is there was a reduction in policy and legislation and communication of about $35,000. So what is the reason for this reduction? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is to decrease reflects the sunset portion of the French language services. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess just to follow up, is this a federal funded program, or is this something from the N.W.T that was funded for this? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that is correct. It was a federally funded program. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the Minister for that answer. So has the department been working with the federal government for a potential program in this area again, or is that not going to happen again? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The French language services goes through ECE, so that question will have to be directed to that department if they're going to continue to pursue that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson? Nothing further from Mr. Thompson. Any further comments or questions on corporate management? Seeing none, we'll call this activity Corporate Management Operations Expenditure Summary. Activity total $8,037,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Moving on. Economic diversification and business support. This activity is found on pages 214 to 218. $17,313,000. Questions or comments from committee? Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In regards to business support, trades, and economy analysis, another program cost, we see a reduction of about $503,000 in this area. Could the minister please expand on why we see this cut in this area? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 122K off the sunset of the Satu Oil and Gas Business Development Administrator position, 123K transfer of the Finance and Admit to Fund portion of the Occupational Health and Safety position, and 31K for fishing industry, and then 225K for diversification, which got reallocated.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
I thank that minister for that clarification on that. So it says N.W.T Business Development Investment Corporates, the $943,000. Is that the BDIC cut? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister?
Yes, Mr. Chair. This is a Phase 2 expenditure reduction of $925K. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Thompson?
So, thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, and I thank the minister for that. So economic diversification, he talked about there's $225,000 coming from program support, trade, and economy analysis, another program cost. Could you expand a little further on where the other difference of $325,000 is coming from? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schuman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's the new growing forward equity that we're going to put forward for $188K and $145K for the South Slave, the new fishery person that we're going to be moving there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 216, it says moving forward is at $488,000. So could the minister just maybe elaborate a little further and what he talked about with the economic diversification in there, the amount, because, yeah, I'm just trying to get that clarified. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Thompson, Minister Schumann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is our equity portion for Growing Forward 2, which will be the new CAP program under the Agriculture Department of Federal Government. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schumann. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank for the clarification. Maybe I'll just go on to page 216 in this area here and look at the Growing Forward 2 section. It's $488,000 in this area. Where's the additional cost coming from, or in this area? Because right now my numbers don't match up, so maybe the minister can just clarify that, and I can, it'll help me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schumann.
Could I get the member to rephrase the question? I don't totally understand what he's asking.
Thank you, Minister Schumann. Mr. Thompson, clarify.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair. So in Growing Forward, there's 488,000 on page 216. When we talked about the economic diversification, there was a portion of that money was earmarked for that. So where's the difference in that money? Is it a federal program that this money's coming from, or is this internal transfer? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister Schumann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That'll be in the schedule for work on behalf of others. That'll be the federal portion of the new CAP program. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schumann. Mr. Thompson.
Okay, no, I'll ask that question in 231. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a series of questions. Commercial fisheries, this is the section to discuss that. I won't go too much into the fish processing plant and that type of stuff. I know there's a lot of activities going on related to the revitalization strategy, the commercial fisheries revitalization strategy, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of organization to this outside of the fisheries strategy. Is there an action plan that the minister can share with the committee so that we can see what is exactly happening with this strategy and how it's being implemented?
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schumann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We presently have a project task team that's working on this, and at some point we want to come in front of committee to present. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schumann. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What kind of timeline are we looking at before we can get some sort of definitive action plan or presentation to committee? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schumann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As of, I think even today, we're meeting with the Tucho fishery, our staff is, but after March 8th, I think is hopefully when we can get in front of committee to explain where we're at. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schumann. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is also under the line item commercial fisheries. I believe that's the industry support program. And the issue was brought to me by the fishermen, and I brought this up with the department at business planning. The issue is that this money is there to support the fishermen so we can get this industry going. Eventually, that money will be gone, I assume, once the industry is profitable enough that this sort of subsidy isn't needed. In the meantime, though, it is needed. And the problem with it is that after we approve this, it's going to take possibly months for this to go out. And it's an ongoing issue when it comes to nonprofits or these groups where we approve money and then it takes a long time for it to get where it's going. I know that we're not going to miss a paycheck. I know that the money's coming to us after April 1st. It doesn't take 6 weeks to get us paid. And so can we do something so that the fishermen can get this money that is coming to them April 1st, April 2nd, sometime sooner than May or June when they've been getting it traditionally, because they use this money to gear up for the next season. And so they're already weeks behind by the time they get these payments, because they're not using the money to gear up for the season. They're using what they have for rent and truck payments and that kind of stuff. So can we get the fishermen paid promptly this year? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schumann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I met with some of the fishermen when I was home this weekend, and I thought that we'd have a winter fishery, and I believe that would be a concern of mine going forward if that was to take place, but it doesn't sound like they're going to do any winter fishing this year, is from my understanding, talking to some of the fishermen. Come April 1st, when the new money rolls out, the fishermen ain't going to get out on the lake till, late June to do that part of it. But we can have a look at this, but I always thought that the subsidy was based on the amount of fish that was caught, and then it was put out that way, and not advanced in a manner of based on fishermen or something like that, but we can have a look at it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my understanding is that they're paid for the catches from the previous year, and perhaps that's incorrect, but there are some monies that they would prefer to get up front. Maybe that's through the Northern Development Food, or the Northern Food Program. Maybe that's through some other program. But that's one of the issues that was raised with me, because even though they're maybe getting out in June, they have to gear up for that in April, May. In addition, I have questions about the business development, about the community transfers, community futures. I believe that's where we are here. Southwest Territorial Business Development Corp. I believe that falls under community futures. And looking at the most recent report I could find from 2015-16, I see that there's 7 development corps. All are funded by ITI except for the Southwest Territorial Business Development Corp. And I was wondering if the minister could explain why that is.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman?
They won't sign the contribution agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is the South Slave outfit has not asked to sign a contribution agreement with us when presented with them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good to see that they don't need the government support, that they're doing it on their own. I have a question about seed funding. In the business plan, there's a very scant support for this program. And I know it's a good program. I know from anecdotal experience that it's a good program. But in the business plan, it basically says, we've handed out this much money in seed funding. This many people have applied for seed funding. But that's not really support for why we should approve seed funding. Is the department, does it have any sort of substantial information that it can present to the committee about how many jobs have been created through this, or how many businesses have been created, or anything like that? Any sort of substantial information? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know we track a number of these things, and if we were to get a letter from Sketty, I'm sure we can go in front of the committee and give them all that information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll talk to the committee about writing that down and sending it on out again. Let's see. I got a couple minutes left. I'll talk about going forward too, I guess. I see that there is, in 16-17, there include the federal and territorial portions were $759,000. In 17-18, it was $1,032,000, I believe. And this year, it's budgeted at $1.2 million. Now, I know if you look at the grants and contributions document that ITI produces, only a fraction of that money, less than half, goes out as grants and contributions to producers and to communities. And so I was wondering if the department could let us know what's going on with that other $500,000, $700,000 that's being spent through Growing Forward too. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding, we provided that information to committee, but that leftover money is usually used for raw materials, travel, salaries, those sorts of things. But we can have another look at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. $700,000, I wouldn't call that leftover money. That's the bulk of it. And so whose salaries are we paying? I mean, is this money being used basically for government programs as opposed to being diverted to producers and to entrepreneurs and that type of stuff. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding, under agreement with the federal government, we're only allowed to charge a certain amount of administration against this program, and the rest of the money is spent out under the Growing Forward program as it's laid out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I've seen what the minister has sent to committee, and there's hundreds of thousands of dollars listed as salaries and other. And that's sort of what I'm getting at, is what is that? Can I get some more detail about what salaries and other exactly are? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll provide that to the member. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to be sure that I can distribute that to interested parties. So is that something that I will be able to pass on to my constituents if requested? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's probably no, I'll double check, but I'm sure there's not an issue with that. It's no different than a grants and contribution report. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
In the spirit of transparency, you could. Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I have 40 seconds left, so I will go back to fishing. I believe the minister mentioned there was a position, a fishery position, and I heard this also at the Fishermen's Federation meeting. And so has someone been hired to help coordinate this revitalization strategy? If not, when will they be hired, and where will they be located? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is going to be a Fisher Sector Support Officer. That position will be located in Hay River, and it will be advertised as of April 1st. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
All right. Well, let me have a look here. You know what? That's okay. I'll pick it up when we get back to the departmental total. Thanks.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would like to know, there doesn't seem to be any line items here for economic diversification and business support that might be related to supporting the arts, other than there's a Great Northern Arts Festival contribution and the film industry rebate program. So how does ITI support the arts? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We support the arts through on page, so the member knows, on page 215 through the economic diversification line, the $3,396,000, and then also through the SEED program. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So really, it's just the SEED money, the Great Northern Arts Festival, and the film industry rebate program. That's it? Those are the only sort of streams of money that are available for the arts. Is that what the minister's just said? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So last year, ITI alone supported the arts and $1.6 million in total, and I'll read them out here if the member wants to write them down. Arts and crafts, fine arts and performing arts support for under the SEED program, $725,697. Festivals, SEED, $294,471. Raw materials, $125. Film promotion, $311. Regional programming, $125,000, and marketing and promotion, $106,000. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So that was all SEED money, though, right? Is that what I think I heard the minister say?
Thank you, Minister.
No, Mr. Chair, that's not all seed. That's all of our allocation between seed and the line on page where did I say it was here? 215, the economic diversification line. There's some money that comes out of that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I accept what the minister said, but maybe that line item of $3 million needs to be broken down in the next main estimates or through the business plan to provide a little bit more information. And I will double check the business plan on that myself as well. But I want to move on to, and I'm sure the minister is getting well prepared for this review of arts strategy with his colleague, the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. So I want to move on to the agricultural strategy. As I've seen, there's a number of departments that have funding under the agricultural strategy. How is the implementation going to be coordinated, and how will performance successes be measured? Thanks. And who's going to be doing that? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Department of ITI is leading a working group on this thing, and we will be having a monitoring and evaluation that will be following every step of the way going forward on this, that we'll be able to track all the progress on the program. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So is there an evaluation framework then that's available, and can that be shared with committee? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The answer is yes, and we'll hopefully have that finalized by the end of March. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Perfect. The minister is actually anticipating all my questions. So the number that for growing forward on page 216, the $488,000, is that G&W.T's contribution towards growing forward, or does some of that include federal money? Thanks, Mr. Chair. And how much?
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I said to my earlier comments to Member Thompson, this is our equity portion of growing forward, the new CAP program. The federal funding is totally separate above that, and that'll be in the grants and contribution, which shows later in our binder. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. And just for clarification, that's under the work performed on behalf of others. On page 231, it shows the growing forward federal contributions. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just wasn't sure what the G&W.T contribution is, so now I understand that. I want to move on, though, to, I think this is the part of ITI that deals with socioeconomic agreements. Can I just confirm that with the minister?
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, this is not the section. That'll be under the minerals section when we get to that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
I'll save that line till we get to that section. So I think I heard the minister say, and it's shown on page 218, that there's a number of staffing changes that are happening within this activity. And I'll just give a couple of examples. There's 2 fewer people in headquarters. The SAW2 is losing a position. And I think I heard the minister say as well that some other petroleum advisor positions are being phased out. So why are petroleum positions found in this section of the budget and not in the next one, which is called Minerals and Petroleum Resources? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is that this was historically here because it was under the Economic Development Diversification Fund, so maybe that's something we can look at maybe going down the road. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, it might be kind of an academic discussion because I think these positions are disappearing. So I'm just kind of surprised that you've got positions that are related to petroleum in an economic diversification and business support section rather than in the minerals and petroleum resources. So are there any other staff that do work on oil and gas that are in this activity area for ITI. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The short answer is no. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly?
That's interesting to hear. So can I ask just about, while we're on fisheries revitalization, what is the department doing with regard to commercial fishing on this side of the lake, Yellowknife in particular? Is the department doing anything to help support the fishing industry here in Yellowknife? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you read the strategy is for all of Great Slave Lake. It's not just for Hay River, but in particular for the Yellowknife member. We're looking at one of them being the pickup point here in Yellowknife. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, look, I'm not a fisherman, so what's meant by a pickup point here in Yellowknife? Is this a place where the product can be directly exported overseas, or and is that the extent of the support from the department? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this will be a new collection station, which we don't have right now on the north side of the lake. Once this thing is established, we can have fishermen fishing out of, particularly out of Yellowknife, to access the zone on this side of the lake and be able to contribute to our strategy going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So is this like a new fish plant for Yellowknife, or is it just, what does the physical infrastructure actually look like? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think we've have that totally sorted out yet, but I suspect it'll be something that'll be able to hold the fish in a safe manner that we'll be able to transport it to the plant in Hay River. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, that's interesting. So people here catching fish, the fish are going to have to be transported to Hay River for processing before they could come back here to Yellowknife. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
That is correct. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
That's all I've got for now. I'm just a bit surprised at the last one, but I'm sure I'll have a chance to chat with the minister more about it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Hay River's a lot closer than Winnipeg, at least. Next, I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at page 216, the FUR program. Is there any intentions, because of the low activity in the central Mackenzie area, and everybody knows that the best sable comes out of the Cove Lake area, is there any additional resources that could be put into the marketing of the Genuine Mackenzie Valley Fur program for that product harvesting area, considering the low activity in the region? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now when people start talking further, get things a little bit confused between ourselves and ENR, but on our side of it, we look after the Genuine Mackenzie Valley Fur program, and the 155 you see there's a line item is for marketing and promotion of the Mackenzie Valley Fur program. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. McNeely?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand that's the marketing program. I guess what I'm trying to say is there going to be any additional resources considering the cost of everything keeps going up here, and if there's going to be additional resources here to market the sable harvested in the Cove Lake area, considering the prices keep going up? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know the Colville Lake guys produce a large number of sable there, and we continue to help market them and promote them in the marketplace. I think we've even had our staff lately promote the sable fur coat at the Chinese Fur Show, competing with the Russian fur, and we will continue to market that as a Mackenzie Valley fur product moving forward. But as the members asking about supporting the industry a little bit further, that's something that we will have to continue to work with our colleagues at ENR on. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. See nothing further from Mr. McNeely. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple points that I'd like to raise. With regard to the nominee program, I recognize that the federal government plays a certain role in that, but we play a significant role as it relates to the investment attraction piece. And I appreciate that the minister had shared previously with us in this House some statistics about how many folks have applied to the nominee program. But it seems to me that something's not attracting enough attention towards this program. I mean, we see a number of tourists of various kinds here in the territory getting exposure to Yellowknife and the N.W.T. I would think that there might be more opportunity to have more uptake on this program. And so I just wonder if the minister can maybe first start by letting us know what the department's views are in terms of the success of this program. We've been observing it now for a few years. Are there some tweaks or changes that we have to make to be able to attract more people to apply to the program? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, the member asked us some of these questions in the House. First of all, this program is not very old. It's only been around since 2015, and I get the member's point on how do we attract and make this even a better program, considering some of the successes we've had with some of the other stuff that ITI has done. We're working on a few different things. As I've said in the House, we've launched a new website. Going forward, we've tried to streamline and simplify our process to make the process more clear and more user-friendly going forward. We're getting information kits out to immigrant consultants and stuff, and we will continue to work on that. But as I said in the House, we're trying to have myself and the deputy in the department having different conversations about attracting immigrants to the Northwest Territories, and maybe one of the conversations we have to have, and I'm glad to have it with any member on the other side of the House, is, I mentioned in the House that we start looking at possibly immigrants within inside the country who are coming to the Northwest Territories, these sorts of things. And I think when I answered in the House the other day about the question around the amount of money to be invested in Northwest Territories versus BC was $300,000. But one thing that once I went back and read my notes on this program and learned that only applies to Yellowknife. Anything outside of Yellowknife is actually $150,000. And we've had a little bit of uptake of people that are applying, in particular in Hay River and in Nuvik, and possibly one other community. I can't remember what it was right off the top of my head, but there is a different approach to it outside of Yellowknife because of the size of the regions, and the investment is lower. But I'm glad to continue to have these conversations, because we all know in this House bringing immigrants to the Northwest Territories isn't going to do nothing but help us. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the insight that the minister shared. And I also appreciate that there's some focus from the department being paid attention to this. I think that it has lots of room to grow and improve. One of the things, I also respect that there needs to be some degree of certainty with regard to, immigrants providing investment. But, maybe it does have to be a little bit more appealing. I appreciate that other communities outside of Yellowknife, the investment might be $150,000 and Yellowknife is $300,000. But if we're trying to compete with other jurisdictions around the country, then Yellowknife has got to be appealing as well. And if, frankly, if Vancouver or the better part of BC is at 200,000, then I would strongly suggest that the department should look at lowering Yellowknife's to be competitive. One thing that I'm curious to learn a little bit more from the department, tell me if I'm wrong in terms of what activity we're in, but I can't seem to find it anywhere else, and that is, what is the role of ITI as it relates to its support for the knowledge-based economy? And you know, I respect that this is a multi-departmental undertaking, but certainly ITI is going to play an integral role as it relates to the development of our knowledge-based economy. It's a critical piece to diversification. I know it's, again, a relatively new initiative to our mandate, but I'd like to learn from the department what kind of investment that we're going to make in bringing on a knowledge-based economy and having it lead to diversifying the economy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have, I think it's fair to say that at this time, with respect to the knowledge economy and innovation as it relates to the knowledge economy across the Northwest Territories government, that we're very much in a forming stage right now. We have a number of projects that are going on that are going to benefit, say, for example, from the new fiber optic network. So, for example, the N.W.T satellite station is a place where we can start to look at a cluster of activities around the fact that that data will be downloaded. So other departments that we're connected with have a project on a geoscience project, geospatial data project. I think it was canvassed with the Minister of Finance. There is a project that is being moved forward on there. So right now, I would say we've got projects. Other departments are looking at research facilities. But I think, to be honest with you, I think it's fair to say that we don't actually have a focus right now in ITI that is looking specifically at the innovation and knowledge agenda. What I will say is that certainly within the department, we're seeing that there's activity. We see there's a capacity with the fiber optic, and we are now looking at if there's a way that we can look at building a framework for what does the knowledge economy actually mean in Northwest Territories? What do we mean when we are looking at what kinds of things need to happen in a geographic area like this in the north? What do we bring to the table in terms of a knowledge economy? Because at the end of the day, knowledge economy is about creating knowledge and new knowledge, but it's also about getting that to a marketplace where it's commodified so that it's actually an economy. So I think it's fair to say that we're in the early days of that, but it's very much on our radar in terms of what we'd like to do working across the departments as part of economic diversification. But we don't have a specific budget item for that at this time either.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the Deputy Minister for his reply, and I appreciate, and I indicated in my comments, that we kind of are in the early stages. But if that's the case, and we're both recognizing that, then I think it's also important that we take the next steps in developing that, making fairly serious commitment and investment to developing the broader scopes of what's expected in an N.W.T knowledge economy. And I also forewarn that we don't have to look for perfection either. I mean, take small, tiny steps. There are a lot of avenues that we could start to go down and invest in prior to knowing and understanding what the big picture is. I gave a couple examples the other day, just very small ones, when I spoke in the House in a member statement about, maybe a young woman in a remote community developing an app, and that app would teach her traditional language to the world because the app is downloadable. Talked about a young man being able to learn from an elder about traditional teepee building and then using those skills as a motivator to maybe become an engineer or an architect that might go on to build housing that respects modernization as well, or modern technology as well as traditional Indigenous lifestyles. So Those are things that we can do now. We don't have to wait to reinvent the wheel on knowledge-based economy to contribute to those kinds of things. So I'd like to see us make a commitment in that regard as soon as we possibly can. For this department, or for this activity right now, Mr. Chair, that's all I have for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Next, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on my honourable friend's comments on knowledge economy. I just wonder what programs the department has to develop or to support innovation in the Northwest Territories. I know there's a significant effort and money available in the federal government across all provinces and territories for innovation. Do we have any innovation projects or strategies in the works? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Between the two members, the comments that are said, moving forward, we may not have a specific line item for the knowledge economy, but those things could be supported through the SEED initiative. But I agree, the knowledge economy is in its early stages. I've been to the innovation table with Minister Baines, and they're working on their initiatives moving forward. And we're trying to line up what we can do to line up with the federal mandate to take best advantage of that. We have a number of things that are working right now. I think that we have to figure out as a territorial government how we're going to pull the knowledge economy all together under one roof, I guess I would say, and which department would take the lead on that, because there's so many different initiatives and different things that could be spread out amongst different departments. But I think this is one of the ones that we as a government have to have a serious look at and have one department lead this program. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, I appreciate that this is a relatively emerging section of our economy, and it's not something that we traditionally thought of as a strength, but you don't need to have, I don't want to see this department to be in a position where it's waiting for the knowledge economy to come about organically, and that it's actually finding ways to stimulate knowledge economy investments and development, and an innovation strategy that rewards private sector investment in innovative solutions. I think dovetails quite well with the coming reality of carbon pricing and green economy solutions to northern mining and manufacturing. So I guess I just want to leave that as a comment that let's build it so it's present in our economy, and it's not just, we're not waiting for it to catch up, because innovators will move to jurisdictions that support innovation, and that would be my final word on that, and I'll invite the minister to comment on it. But I did want to just discuss the BDIC as the next point. So there's quite a substantial cut being proposed to BDIC, around just over $900,000. Is this a one-time deduction? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a phase 2 reduction of $925,000. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. I believe he was asking, is this an ongoing cut or is this a one-time cut? Thank you.
This is ongoing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Testart?
Thank you. So the last budget, there was a cut in that budget to BDIC. Now we're seeing a second year of cuts. Is this an ongoing reduction to the BDIC? Are there going to be future year cuts moving forward, or is this the final round of cuts to BDIC? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ongoing from this point forward after this, I don't anticipate that happening. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart?
Thank you. So again, we've seen the significant cuts to this department, to the BDIC over the last two budgets. What is the long-term vision for the BDIC? you know, are we developing a new strategic plan? Are we just going to reduce the overall financial resources they have to use and transfer the support into the department itself? I mean, there's a lot of rumors on the ground, but the minister could put some of that to rest with a clear vision for the future of the corporation. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't envision BDIC going away. I've met with them a number of times. We have our 5-year program review that's going to be taking place right now, and we've met with them, and they're quite excited about doing that. You know, there's times have changed since BDIC was incorporated, and the business community has changed significantly. We anticipate doing a review and coming back to committee on how we can see this thing operating in the future going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my understanding from stakeholder engagement is that the program review isn't really the issue, that most clients are satisfied with the level of service the programs that BDIC offers. The issue the government seems to take is the operational side, that the BDIC does not have access to, the appropriation to BDIC is in excess of what it needs to do its job. So is the minister also undertaking an operational review to restructure the corporation to be more cost effective? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The program review, we'll look at the operations review, but we're building a term of reference, and we will probably share that with committee once we have them done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I mean, BDIC performs, I've spoken about this before, but BDIC performs, you know, an important role in supporting businesses in the Northwest Territories, providing advice to those companies and those individuals who are interested in getting involved, and of course, through its lending programs. So I understand that looking at the information item, which is included later in the business review on page 227, we see some of their operating results, and they seem to generate a significant amount of surplus. And my understanding is that they can't access that surplus under the terms of the current legislation. Is the minister planning to do anything about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
There's cash that they can use, right? And there's cash that they need.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that's one of the things that we are looking at, and the member is onto it. There's money that they can use right now for certain things and money they can't, and that would be the proposed legislation once we do the review, that we'd want to come back to the Assembly and change so they could do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you. So that money the minister just referred to, or that those financial resources, does the BDIC have access to those own source revenues, essentially, to plug the gap that's being created by successive years of cuts to their appropriation? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so right now they have access to their excess cash for operations, and we have to come forward for the legislative change to be able to use the interest. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Thank you. So the legislative change that's required, when does the minister anticipate bringing that forward?
Thank you, Minister.
May, June session. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Thank you. So the minister also mentioned a program review. Is the review, and that the review would help identify need to change legislation and other issues. So is the review going to take place, is the review going to be completed before the legislation comes forward in May and June? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
He was looking at a much broader review. It's not just...
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the regulations that we want to come forward in May-June session is, the regulations haven't been updated for a long time. We want to be able to make this change so they can use that going forward. But as far as the review and the program review of the operations of that is, we don't need to have that done to be able to do that so they can continue to operate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart?
Yeah, the regulations and legislation are, of course, different. So I'm just wondering, are we talking about legislative change or regulatory change? Because the minister can change the regulations today if he wanted to. Can the minister clarify? Thank you.
Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We were talking about the act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And this just strikes, I'm satisfied that BDSE will have the resources they need to continue to do its work, but it strikes me as odd that we've done 2 years of cuts now to BDIC without a program review, without passing legislation to allow them to do things. It just seems like the cuts are coming ahead of other work that needs to get done, and the minister's in fact relying on these program reviews and legislation in order to continue to support the operations of BDIC. So it just seems odd that, again, we're cutting first and fixing the cuts afterwards. Seems like those things should have been done first, but we'll see where this goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Next, I have Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of questions here under the FUR program. In my riding, we're seeing more and more young trappers getting out on the land here, and I know that there was a concern this fall that we did have a trapping workshop held in one of the communities, but with limited amount of space available. I think that would be a big benefit if we had at least two of these workshops in the communities, each community that's interested. It would be beneficial in the future. There's a lot of interest in trapping. We have good examples in both the Clavic, Fort McPherson. We have a lot of youth that are getting out, that are finished school or going out trapping, making a living here, and we need to encourage that and have more workshops available to them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I stated before, our FUR program is for the Mackenzie Valley FUR program for marketing and promotion, and I believe those questions will probably be better directed to the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources when he comes up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Blake?
Well, I think it's kind of shared between the two departments, because I know under the Mackenzie Valley FUR initiative that you do take trappers down to whether it's North Bay or other auctions throughout Canada, and this is all a part of it, encouraging more trappers. There's huge demand out there, especially, this fall there was a ad out for 20,000 muskrats that, it's pretty tough to get up in our area at the moment because of population, but, I think it's a responsibility between both departments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I've said, we're in charge of the marketing and promotion of this, but we can certainly have a discussion with the Minister of ENR that working cohesively together to be able to help the trappers in the best way we can to support them marketing and selling their furs. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Blake?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under commercial fisheries, is this available to, say, folks up in the Beaufort Delta region, or is this specific to only Yellowknife and here? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe he's talking about the line item on page 216 for commercial fisheries, and that's a support program that we have there for freight and production costs of fishing in the Northwest Territories. I know our department has been up to the members region and had a workshop there to see who's interested in in getting into the commercial fishery in that region, and we had a number of stakeholders participate in that. I've recently had a chat with the chief of Sigachik actually around the discussion of how we can continue to promote that, and we will continue to work towards that initiative going forward, and I'd gladly sit down with a member anytime he wants and see how we can support commercial fishing in his region. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. The member's question was, is the money under that line item, is that available to people from his region? Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Though I think that's the point I was trying to make. There's no commercial fishing being done in that region yet, but if there was, that money would be there for them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Nothing further from Mr. Blake. I see no further comments on this. Everyone may speak to each activity once. Everyone has spoke to this activity. So I will call this activity Economic Diversification and Business Support Operations Expenditure Summary, $17,313,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Next, Mineral and Petroleum Resources. This is found on pages 219 to 222 with the expenditure summary on page 220. First, I have Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A while ago, I was talking to some representatives from maybe even the minister. I might have brought it up during business planning. A position that, or not a position,